Welcome back to Cultivate Talk. Today's conversation is about something we hear a lot about, but don't always know how to practice: dialogue across difference. I'm joined by Dr. Larry Schooler, a facilitator, researcher, and practitioner who works with cities, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations to build consensus around deeply contentious issues. From mending relationships between law enforcement and community, to helping cities envision memorials after tragedy, to guiding nonprofits through internal conflict, Larry's work sits at the intersection of communication, healing, and public decision making. In this episode, we explore what makes dialogue genuine rather than performative, how truth and reconciliation models can help communities move forward after harm, and why those most affected by conflict must be directly involved in resolving it. If you've ever wondered whether communication can truly heal or how to navigate disagreement in a polarized world, this conversation offers both hope and practical insight. Let's get into it. Thank you so much for being here with me this morning, Dr. Schooler. I really appreciate it, and I'm super excited to talk about your research. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be headed into the winter break and have a chance to sit back and reflect with you.
Absolutely. I'm super glad to catch you kind of before winter break. We fully get into winter break, I should say. I know some in academia have basically been there since Thanksgiving, and I can't totally blame them, but it's nice when the timeline actually catches up with us and we can all enjoy winter break. So, your work is just incredibly fascinating. So, to kind of kick things off, you've worked with cities, nonprofits, and communities on some incredibly sensitive and high stake issues. How did you first find yourself drawn to this kind of work in dialogue and conflict resolution?
It's a great question, and I think for most people who do this kind of work, it's usually a pretty circuitous path with a lot of zigs and zags, and that's certainly true for me. Um, when I first got out of college, I was in journalism, and I really, leaned into stories that involved, as you would expect, a lot of tension, a lot of controversy, a lot of, passionately held views. And I went from journalism into being an aide to an elected official. And here in Austin, where I was doing that, we have a very engaged population. People really care about the city and about the direction that it's going to take. And so I found myself just constantly in public policy making settings where I needed to be something of a mediator without the training, just to be somebody who could, bridge divides between different segments of our community, different stakeholders with different interests. And there was one project in particular that when I talk about it sounds so kind of banal, but it had to do with events that close streets. So like a 5K, a marathon, a street festival, etc. And all of the ripple effects that was having on downtown businesses and residents and houses of worship and so on. And so, I worked on that for the better part of a year and was really proud of what we were able to achieve in the way of consensus recommendations. And so I thought to myself, it'd be really nice if I could make this my living. I don't quite know how to do that. The city later went on to create a position that sort of allowed me to do that. And then, I furthered my understanding of the field through graduate study and a lot of professional development. But it really was kind of a matter of just being in a moment where the person that I was working for needed somebody who could be that shuttle diplomat, that facilitator, that mediator to help get consensus on public policy. And I enjoyed doing it without any training, and just felt like I wanted to become really skilled at it from there. So that's where it kind of took off.
That's amazing and incredibly fascinating. You seem so well immersed in it prior to graduate studies that now I can only imagine the many different perspectives and viewpoints that you have amongst the field in general. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I think one of the big aha moments for me when it came to furthering my study and just getting deeper into this is just how differently different populations think about even what conflict is, much less how to resolve it. There's so many
Yeah.
different perceptions of what constitutes conflict, which conflicts should be addressed and which should be let alone and which should escalate and all the rest. And I think when I was working in the field, it was kind of a narrow band of things that I was dealing with. And so the graduate studies really allowed me to kind of open my eyes to just a much broader universe of need and complexity and nuance to the work, and that's made it all the more fascinating to continue to pursue it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you enter a situation where tensions are already high, say between law enforcement and the community, what's the very first step you take to begin building trust?
I think that the most important thing that I can do is to make a commitment that I then keep. So, it can be something as small as I'm going to call you at 2:30 and then calling them at 2:30, or if we agree on a next step or a follow-up, I promptly complete that follow-up action. I want the relationship to be built away from the table where I'm mediating or facilitating as much as I can. So if I'm going to work with law enforcement or if I'm going to work with any stakeholder, I'm going to really make a point of trying to visit with them in some depth before we really get started with whatever work we're going to try to do. It's not always possible, but I really try to do it. And I just want to impress upon them that in order for this endeavor to be successful, I'm going to be there and I'm going to be supporting them, and I need their help for it to be successful.
I really think that the thing that's going to create the most trust between me and whoever I'm working with is when they see me do what I say I'm going to do, or just take actions that show them that I am there to support them and support everybody involved in the work that I'm doing. I make it a point to try to visit with folks that I'm working with as extensively as I can before we sort of get around the table and actually start doing the heavy lifting. And during those conversations, I try to get to know them independently of whatever role they're playing in the process. And some folks are more inclined to open up than others, but those conversations are often very revealing and very consequential. I can remember one where I knew the stakeholder coming in had very strongly held views of what the ultimate outcome of the process should be. And I knew that those views were not in line with the other members of the group. And so my task there wasn't to tell him that he was off base or, on a quixotic mission or something, but just to say, are you in a position to be able to, work with others and adapt what it is that you think is your perfect outcome in order to achieve consensus with the group? And not only did he say he was, he really was. So those conversations at the beginning are really important because I need to impress upon the participants that I'm going to be with them every step of the way, and it's only going to succeed if they stay engaged. And so it's kind of a partnership that we're building, and the trust is only going to get built when they see me do the things that I commit to doing in those early conversations. So, it can be as simple as I'm going to call you at this time, or I'm going to send you the notes by this date, or I'm going to follow up on something you asked me to follow up on. But that stuff really matters, especially in very sensitive situations. The other big piece, of course, is the whole notion of objectivity, neutrality. Some people are calling it multi-partiality. This idea that you'll have people that really are trying to persuade or coerce you to back their point of view or to kind of lean in their direction. And as a mediator, that's against my ethics. I'm really focused on creating a space where everyone feels comfortable participating and not taking any sides. And so it's really important in the building of trust to show that I'm receiving those different perspectives with equal vigor, with equal levels of interest, and that nobody feels as if I'm, calling on them a lot less or being less vociferous in my appreciation for their contributions to the conversation or taking them any less seriously. That's the kind of stuff that I think is important to building trust as well right out of the gate.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I feel like that's something that's probably so applicable to many different fields, yet probably not as well communicated as how you just explained it. So thank you so much. That is so great. So you've helped organizations and governments create spaces for dialogue. What makes a dialogue work, per se? In other words, what distinguishes a genuine conversation from a performative one?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I think a lot of it has to do with the preparation, not just on the part of someone like myself in isolation in terms of the planning, but also in terms of the way in which people are being invited and maybe selected to participate in that dialogue. It really takes a certain either set of skills or at least inclination to tap into those skills in order to be a meaningful participant in dialogue, which is to say that in a social conversation, it's generally okay if I take a position and stick to it and, argue passionately if I'm with friends and people that I trust and we know that we're going to be friends afterwards, or coworkers where I have that level of previous relationship and foundation. A lot of times, though, in the work that I'm doing, the people who are involved in the conversation, even if they may know each other, it's normally not in the context of long-lasting friendship or partnership. So they need to be prepared by me and by our process to embrace difference, to lean into curiosity rather than contradiction. Be willing to be convinced that you're either mistaken about something or just don't have the full story. So there's a lot that goes into either selecting who's going to be part of the dialogue or just setting them up for success in terms of the approach you want them to take. And then I think it's critically important that the questions that you're asking and the prompts that you're using for dialogue are, of course, open-ended, but also not easily answered. Something that really requires somebody to think and not just revert back to sort of a talking point type approach, the way a performative experience might be. You need to get someone beyond what AI might generate for them to what's their personal lived experience or worked experience on a particular topic or issue, and what do they uniquely have to offer on whatever it is that we're talking about. So there's a piece to getting the participants ready and getting folks around the table who can do the heavy lifting of being open-minded and willing to consider other viewpoints. And then there's, creating that space where the questions provoke new discoveries, even about yourself, much less about others and other perspectives around the table, around the room.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes great sense. So, your research explores truth and reconciliation models used across cities and nations. For those unfamiliar with that term, how would you describe what a truth and reconciliation process looks like and what it can offer to communities in conflict?
I like how you said for those unfamiliar. I think it's most of the population that's unfamiliar. But no, truth and reconciliation as a concept has been around for quite a number of decades now. And I think it was even around much before that. It's just become more formalized here in the last, I would say, 50 or so years in countries around the world. I think most people who've heard of truth and reconciliation have probably heard of it in the context of the extraordinary South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But to take a step back, what we're talking about, as the name kind of implies, is a process in which a community or a state or a country tries to get to the bottom of something that has really ailed that population. So in the case of South Africa, of course, it was apartheid, it was racism. In other communities, it may be other kinds of mass bigotry or discrimination, or it could be a change in leadership and government, where there's a transitional justice kind of component to it, where we're trying to, understand the depths of what happened under the previous regime. And then, as if not more important, is this idea of trying to bring, opposing or warring parties together in some way in that reconciliation piece. And that's, I think, in some ways the much harder thing to do, where there's much less of a template per se to get that done, but there certainly are examples of that. But I think what's happened in the US and in Canada is that a few communities and the nation of Canada have embraced this model as a way not only to examine a dark episode or period of the past, but also to ask, what do we do with what we've learned about that dark episode? How do we ensure that all people are treated fairly? How do we reduce discriminatory practices? How do we properly acknowledge harm done in the past? So, when these hearings are open to the public, as they usually are, you just get these extraordinary, not just admissions or confessions or recollections of past harm, but also an opportunity to move forward in a really meaningful way. So it's a very powerful tool that I would hope more communities and even countries would begin to consider embracing to move themselves forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what lessons from large scale truth and reconciliation efforts, like those in post conflict countries, can local governments or organizations apply to their own internal challenges?
Well, I think part of the challenge is that a lot of the countries where this has been adopted are doing it in the context of we just had an autocratic regime and now we're moving towards democracy, or just some other major upheaval that a lot of communities, at least in the US, are less likely to have experienced. So there's a question, I think, that's legitimate around how do we take a model that was set up to do that and sort of convert it to our context. And I guess what I would say is the best thing that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission can do is involve lay people from different points of view and different parts of a community in really scrutinizing something that has beguiled a community for a long time, that has, evaded kind of simple fixes, that's been hard for a community to solve. And it may be an episode from that city's past that some folks feel has been swept under the rug and not properly examined, but it also could be a broader trend, around blight or unaffordability or police community relations and so on. And I think that the TRC process can bring voices into the conversation who otherwise might have felt disenfranchised, because I think we have to acknowledge that the ways in which we have typically asked people to raise their voices carry with them a lot of risk. I mean, obviously, when you march on the street or protest, you're always subjecting yourself to the potential for, arrest or other kinds of unwanted attention. But even when we ask someone to come testify at a city council meeting or a state legislative hearing, and those opportunities aren't necessarily that abundant, but that takes an enormous amount of courage and patience and disposable time to commit to those 3 or so minutes that you're often given. And so a TRC comes along with an entirely different approach, with a much more, I would call it, humane approach, where oftentimes people can give their testimony even in private, just with one member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the staff, or they can give it in public, but they're not listening to a buzzer to stop them. They're not told, to stick to the topic. It's like, this is your opportunity to be heard, and we're here to listen to you, and to not necessarily scrutinize what you're saying in the moment, but to take it in and then reflect on it later. So I just think it's a really unique way of involving your community or your country in conversation that would really benefit a lot of places.
Yeah, and you mentioned the risk and kind of the emotions that surround that potential risk. So it's a really good segue to my next question. So many of the situations you work in involve deep pain or mistrust, or perhaps situations that you have seen or previously have been involved in. How do you navigate those emotions while helping people move toward closure and healing?
I learned a really powerful lesson about this, Emily, when I was working in Salt Lake City, Utah. They had a racial equity in policing commission, and the folks I was working with and I were brought in a little bit late, a little bit after they had gotten underway. And so we were trying to kind of jump on a moving train in terms of the process they had already started. And what I came to understand was that there was sort of an invisible, metaphorical wall that existed between particularly rank and file members of the Salt Lake City Police Department and members of the commission who had had some sort of difficult interaction with police, sometimes a severely difficult interaction. And so we created a space that was not recorded, not streamed live, where both members of the commission and the police officers could be extremely candid. So the touch that I used as a facilitator was lighter than if it had been a what I'd call a business meeting or a formal deliberation. And we just tried to create as much space as we could, sort of a mini truth and reconciliation process for officers to be able to share how it makes them feel to be so heavily scrutinized, to be accused of racism and bigotry and discrimination, and also for community members to feel such disdain, distrust, even loathing for members either of a particular police department or police in general based on a deeply traumatic experience. And so the main thing that I was focused on was sort of lifting up the fact that multiple things can be true that seem to be in deep tension or contradiction with one another. That Officer Jones or Smith could certainly be doing her or his job without bigotry, without racist overtones, and what Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones experienced at the hands of a Salt Lake City police officer could have also been laden with racial discrimination and bigotry and discrimination. And I think that was certainly a moment in that process where, the thing that's most important for people in conflict is to feel heard, even if they don't get the substantive outcome that they're striving for. They need to know that they're being heard and seen and respected. And so when someone's been through trauma and we can lay some groundwork for them to gently be walked through that and share that to an audience that's listening intently and taking what they're saying seriously, then I think you can have a significant breakthrough in your process and in that person's life and moving forward in general.
Yeah, absolutely. That's incredible. So, in your experience, what role does communication and like the way people talk and listen play in actually resolving conflict versus just managing it?
It's a good question. Well, I mean, one of the things that I think about when you're saying that is our own children. We have a 14-year-old
Right.
and an 11-year-old, and it's been very interesting to me to see how, communication patterns have evolved. I like to joke that my older son, grew substantially and his word count dropped substantially within about a year. So I think it's important to respect the fact that just because, people of different generations or different communities communicate in different ways or across a different set of media doesn't, in their minds, make it less meaningful. Just because my son sent a direct message on social media to someone as opposed to having an in-depth conversation with them doesn't mean that it wasn't a meaningful exchange for him. And so part of I think the challenge is to recognize that there's, of course, the substance of what's being said, the nonverbal ways in which we're communicating, which of course are harder to pick up over digital communication, and then the substance, the fact that they're giving us a particular message, and every message that we deliver is encoded in ways we don't fully understand. And when we receive messages, we look at them through a particular lens. There's this great theoretical concept of the lens model, where you and I can be standing and looking at the same scene, both with cameras, and what we produce as a picture is completely different based on frame and light and focus and all the rest. So I think that when we're in a situation of communicating in conflict, we should initially ask ourselves, what do we want for ourselves? What do we need? How will we feel heard? And I'll just speak for myself. Like, I want someone to make eye contact with me. I want them to be free of distraction. I want them to say more than just mm-hmm or uh-huh or, that's fair. I want them to engage with me either with follow-up questions or, it sounds like you felt this and that. So just a way in which I can then know that they've been listening to me. So once I analyze that, I'm going to try to put into practice some of the things that I want to receive as a communicator when the other person is communicating with me. And not all of them will work. The other person may want me to be in a different way. even in marriages or very close relationships, there are different needs that the different partners may have in those exchanges. And it's really important to check in and make sure you know what it is that your partner is expecting. But I don't think you can go wrong too often when you think to yourself, well, this is what would make me feel heard and respected and make my communication feel meaningful. And let me do the same for the person with whom I'm communicating.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I love your example in the beginning because I think when we think about different generations, and I think this can be applied to different cultures as well, obviously, kind of like what you were explaining with the lens theory, like we are going to constitute like meaningful communication completely differently, maybe due to our generation or age or due to our culture and background. And I think this is such an important like facet of our discipline to kind of talk about and research and like just like continuously keep in conversation so people understand like all that's at play in communication, especially with conflict, because I know, like personally speaking, from like a cultural standpoint, how conflict is managed and handled is totally dependent on like which family member is going through the conflict. And
For
so
sure.
I think it's like, and that's like that speaks to just like how their own personal upbringing as well as their cultural roots and how that kind of has implicated their communication and how they just handle conflict. And so I think it's such an interesting point of conflict and especially like conflict resolution when we think about it from a communication standpoint.
Well, and one of the things we have to realize is that the way in which we were conditioned to think about this is very particular and not necessarily universal. So I didn't really reflect deeply on the way conflict was handled in my own household until, many years after I left that household. And I've come to understand that, you know, in mostly healthy and occasionally some unhealthy ways, my family of origin leaned hard into uh, conflict and addressing it, head on. And again, sometimes it manifests in ways that were a little tough, but it's been helpful for me. And I give my students an exercise, a conflict interview exercise, where I ask them to talk either with a parent or a sibling or a significant other, about some of the ways that they think the person has developed a little bit of a conflict identity. And the point is not to say, well, how you grew up was wrong or that's ridiculous or whatever, but just to say, is the way that you've grown up thinking about this the way that you want to continue, but not to assume that, well, it's conflict. Everybody deals with what I dealt with. Yes, everybody has conflict, but not necessarily does it get addressed in the same ways across cultures and communities and generations. And so it's an adventure in a way of discovery to kind of figure out, choose your own adventure, maybe is a better way to put it, to figure out the kind of style you want to take in approaching it as you mature.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, with your kind of work, how do you measure success? And I'm like putting that in quotes since that could be an incredibly fluid term. But like, when healing and consensus can take so many different forms, like, how do you measure such a thing?
Well, it's a great question, and almost always I throw that back at whoever it is that I'm working with. I ask them, what they're going to define, because, I think that particularly in the mediation space, we often hear mediators boast about the number of cases that they've settled. And I think that's become sort of a de facto measure of success. Either I've resolved 1,000 disputes, or I have a 90 some percent clearance rate. And I understand that. I mean, it's not much different than the batting average in baseball or the field goal shooting percentage in basketball. We all want some sort of metric because there are a lot of people doing this work, and so it's hard to know, is someone good, or not,
Hmm.
without some sort of quantifiable metric. I think for me, I'm looking for not just the folks I'm working with to define what success will look like, but also I'm looking for engagement. I'm looking to see whether they are, able to actively participate in the work that we're doing. So if it's a group facilitation, is everybody speaking, and when folks are contributing, are they doing so in a way that's not getting, bluntly refuted by another participant? Are they being warmly received? So, are we meeting our objectives for the meeting? Are we staying within the discussion agreements that we had? Are we making the progress on the issue that we set out to in the objectives that we set? And are folks really participating in a way that feels meaningful to them? I'd be kidding you, or I'd be lying to you if I said that I don't want that consensus outcome when I'm finished with whatever it is that I'm doing. And oftentimes that's part of the mandate. We need you to get this group to, agree in some form or fashion, vote or consensus or what have you, to a particular, set of decisions. So that is often a critical piece, but those other things are, I think, not necessarily easier to achieve, but easier to measure, easier to benchmark. And it's also a good way to mark your progress along the way, so that folks who may be getting impatient can see that incremental progress being made and things trending in the right direction. But I think it's really important for people to recognize that there are circumstances in which something doesn't settle, and that's for the best, or the outcome that's arrived at via consensus isn't what the person would have preferred or wanted, but they're also relieved that they were heard and that it's over. So it's just hard to know, what that's going to mean, what success is going to mean to different people until you ask. And then I think by having a legitimate process with good guardrails and good orientation and sticking to that and getting folks involved in that, you can achieve some important successes along the way.
Totally. And I kind of love the more collaboration oriented way of measuring that success, in a sense of asking versus just coming up with it on your own. So I think that's
well,
great.
and you can see in a variety of high profile circumstances where the person playing that third party role is sort of zealously pursuing a specific outcome that will either benefit them or just make it seem as if everything was a success. And what that can often mean is that the parties feel coerced, feel rushed, feel kind of pulled towards just getting a deal, whatever that deal might be. And that can have serious ramifications down the road for those parties. And so I just am very conscientious of checking my own impulses where, I can remember one process in particular where, about midway through, it looked like we were getting to a pretty significant milestone and victory. And I sometimes second guess myself, but I also told the people around the table to go talk with your constituencies to see how this sits with them. And when they came back, they had a lot of concerns, but I don't really regret doing that, because I think I would rather have something that was that took longer to get done or even didn't get done than something that got done and then folks were spending a lot of energy fighting to repeal it or to push back on it. So it's a very tricky thing to define what that is, but it needs to be something the parties and the third party, I think about together.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So, as someone who's dedicated your career to dialogue and healing, excuse me, what gives you hope about the current state of public discourse, and what worries you?
Well, I think what worries me is just how difficult it can be to see the kind of discourse happening that I want to see in people's day-to-day lives. It's not like, you can sort of walk around a city in America, a community in America, or look at mainstream media and see a lot of examples of this on a regular basis. And so and I don't know that a lot of the folks in national leadership roles are holding up, examples of what this can be. And it's not that they never have. It's not that the system, prohibits them from doing so. But for whatever reason, over the last several years, we just haven't seen very many examples of that. And if anything, people are, politically punished almost for some of their across the aisle kinds of moves. And so I think that it's tough when it feels as if I'm rowing against the tide, where there's just so much momentum for, defeating the other side rather than, seeing things from the other side's point of view. And without, really powerful role models willing to use their voice to advocate for that, I think, we're gonna stay stuck in place a little bit. But I certainly think that we're seeing an enormous number of organizations here in the last decade or so rise up with some or all of their mission being to do work like this. And it's pretty remarkable. I mean, I almost can't believe, and it's become almost impossible for me to keep up with all of the different organizations and programs that have this similar kind of overlapping mission of either dialogue across difference or bridging divides or, consensus building. And that's really encouraging. And I think that as I look at some of what's happening at my, kids level, I see a lot less of the same kinds of strife that I think afflicts us at the grown person level. And so there's a part of me that feels a lot of hope just in this next generation saying enough, that we're tired of this. We want something different. We are going to co-create with you that different thing. So that certainly, I think, gives me hope. And just seeing the students come through classes like the ones I teach and similar ones, who are sort of embracing this idea that there is an alternative to, certainly to violence, but also to vitriol and to sharply critical, toxic language. So to see that is very encouraging, and to see just this veritable explosion of groups trying to do it is something that gives me a lot of hope also.
That's great. I love that you ended with what gives you hope. I should have worded that question probably a little better to encourage.
It's okay. That's okay.
But I appreciate that you kind of took that direction of what worries you first and then what gives you hope, because that's the way it should be, honestly. So, if someone listening wanted to become wanted to become better at engaging across difference in their own life, where should they start?
It's a great question. I mean, the first place I would want them to start is trying to identify someone whom they are sure or pretty convinced has a different perspective than them on something. And it doesn't need to be what we might call political. It could just be something that they both are interested in. I mean, it could be within an organization they're both a part of, or even a family matter, or, a neighborhood issue. It doesn't have to be, immigration, abortion, things of that nature. It could be something lower profile, but still important. And I think that starting a conversation with that person with the preface that you're not there to convince them of anything, and you're not wanting to debate. You just really want to better understand the way they feel, and hopefully they'll be open to understanding a little bit more about how you feel. And some organizations across the country have certainly created ways for you to be paired with someone and then, exchange viewpoints in a meaningful way from different perspectives. And so I certainly encourage folks to look up groups like Unify America and Braver Angels, and even StoryCorps has some cool tools as well. But I mean, I think that for me, and this is something I need to get more in the habit of, but I would want to find someone who I just knew was coming from a different perspective. Could be political, could be religious, could be urban and rural, what have you, some combination, and just forge a conversation with them with those caveats that we're not there to win an argument, that we're just there to learn a little bit more about each other's perspective.
Yeah, that's so well said and so important too. I think when people think about conflict, and this is just like through what I hear from students and like my own personal experience, it's like there has to be a specific outcome. Somebody has to win, somebody has to be proven right. And rarely do these situations or these, communicative events happen where like it really is just about learning and either adapting or accepting or just expanding perspective and expanding knowledge. And I think it's so important because I think even outside of communication, we live in a world that's very oriented towards like who won the argument, who's right, who has the better evidence to prove their point of view even stronger and whatnot. So I think it's such an important reminder for people in all walks of life.
Well, and the other thing is that this comes up for me a lot as a professor in higher education, because I think those of us who are in higher education have to realize that if we're just in the business of imparting information to students, we could be replaced. There's not a monopoly anymore, and there hasn't been really since before the internet, but certainly the internet. There's not a monopoly on being an information source, and what we can offer, if we're thoughtful about it, is a space where we provide some context and tools and then make way for the students to talk with each other about the things that are covered in our classes. And I can remember the day after, might have been a couple of days after Charlie Kirk had been assassinated, a student of mine asked if we could devote some class time to talking about this. And I felt we should, not to take any sort of position on, any of the issues talked about, but just to reflect on what this moment meant. And certainly there was such an enormous reaction to it across all different perspectives. And I had some students tell me it was the first time they had, cried in a classroom, not bawled, but I mean, gotten emotionally expressive. And I think that it was as meaningful to them as anything that I could stand in front of the room and tell them. And so would I do that on the first day of class? No, probably not. But I think we have to appreciate the unique opportunity of having, a room full of thoughtful people in the same place, and not waste that. Use that as a chance to build some of the skills that you and I have been talking about in this conversation. Challenge them to be skillful dialogue participants in moments like that are safer than just going up to someone, out in public that they may not know. They often don't know their classmates very well, and so it can be a challenge even in that setting. But it can be, eye-opening in an enormously meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my last question for you is if you could leave listeners with one key idea about how communication can support healing, what would it be?
I'd say the instinct that you have to push back on something you're hearing can be overcome by tell me more, or I hadn't thought of it that way. Can you explain that a little more? Or just leaning into curiosity over contention. So there will be plenty of times when you're communicating, even in a non-conflictual situation, that you feel this instinct, I know I do, to just sort of push back, to challenge. And at that moment, if you can harness the part of you that probably has been there since you were really little, really young. We think about how little kids, why, they always ask questions out the wazoo, at least mine did. Go back to that child and just lean into a deeper understanding, a quest for deeper understanding of what the person's saying before doing anything to try to refute or respond to what it is that they're saying. So give yourself that moment of I'm not comfortable with, or I don't like what the person is saying, but I probably don't fully understand it. Let me try to understand it a little bit more. So lean into curiosity over contention.
Beautiful. I love that so much. Lean into curiosity. I think that is beautifully said. And I want to say thank you so much for taking some time today and talking about your fascinating work. I personally love the topic of conflict because I don't know if I'm like super great at handling it like on a personal level. So when I get to talk about it and like read about it, I feel like it also helps me and I just learn so much from people like you. So I know people listening will also feel the same way. And I do. I appreciate you talking about your work, answering my questions, and, informing us a little bit more on healing and communication and conflict resolution as a whole.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much, and I appreciate your interest.
And that concludes our conversation with Dr. Larry Schooler. What stays with me is the reminder that conflict resolution isn't about quick fixes or perfectly worded statements. It's about creating spaces where people most affected by harm can be heard, involved, and respected. Dialogue, when done well, isn't performative. It's participatory, it's relational, and it has the potential to create real healing. In a moment where public discourse can feel fractured and reactive, this episode invites us to slow down, listen differently, and think about how we might engage across difference with more intention and courage. As always, thank you for listening to Cultivate Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who cares about stronger communities, healthier organizations, or more meaningful dialogue. Until then, keep cultivating conversations that matter.